Tonight, we begin with a story that's been told countless times, yet somehow never loses its magic. A tale of two people whose love transcended the ordinary, whose hearts found each other across impossible circumstances, and whose devotion became legendary. This isn't just another superhero story. It's the kind of gentle romance that reminds us why love stories have captivated humanity since the beginning of time. So before we drift into this peaceful narrative, take a moment to get comfortable, pull up your blankets, and let your mind settle into the rhythm of a love that began with a single glance and grew into something extraordinary. In the bustling city of Metropolis, where skyscrapers reached toward clouds and millions of people hurried through their daily lives, there lived a young woman named Lois Lane. She wasn't particularly tall or short, wasn't remarkably beautiful in the way magazine covers demanded, but she possessed something far more captivating. Intelligence sparkled in her dark eyes, determination set the line of her jaw, and curiosity colored every word she spoke. Lois worked as a reporter for the Daily Planet, Metropolis's most respected newspaper, and she approached her job with the kind of passion that made others either admire her tremendously or find her slightly intimidating. Every morning, Lois would arrive at the Daily Planet building before the sun fully painted the sky. She loved the quiet moments when the newsroom was empty, when her heels clicked softly against the polished floors, and when the city below was just beginning to wake up. She would make herself a cup of coffee, strong and black, and sit at her desk surrounded by stacks of papers, photographs, and half-finished articles. Her colleagues often wondered how she managed to juggle so many stories at once. But Lois had a secret. She genuinely cared about every story she wrote, every person she interviewed, every truth she uncovered. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the leaves gold and orange outside her office window, Lois was investigating a series of mysterious rescues that had been happening throughout the city. People falling from buildings were somehow caught safely. Cars careening out of control suddenly stopped without explanation. Children who had wandered too close to dangerous situations found themselves gently moved to safety. The police had no explanations. The witnesses described impossible things. A figure in blue, moving faster than eyes could follow. Someone flying through the air with impossible grace. Most of her colleagues dismissed these reports as hysteria, mistaken identity, or simple luck. But Lois had learned to listen when the impossible whispered its presence. She had filled 3 notebooks with witness accounts, sketched rough drawings based on descriptions, and marked locations on a map of the city. There was a pattern here, a story begging to be told, and Lois Lane had never met a mystery she couldn't solve. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest apartment that overlooked a small park, a young man named Clark Kent was preparing for his own day at the Daily Planet. Clark had only recently moved to Metropolis from the small farming town of Smallville, and everything about city life still amazed him. The way thousands of people could live so close together, the constant hum of traffic and conversation, the incredible diversity of restaurants, bookshops, and theaters, all within walking distance of each other. Clark was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and dark hair that never quite stayed perfectly in place, no matter how much he tried to smooth it down. He had been hired as a reporter at the Daily Planet just 2 weeks ago, and he was still adjusting to the pace of city journalism. Back in Smallville, the biggest story might be the annual Harvest Festival, or a new business opening on Main Street. Here in Metropolis, news happened constantly, urgently, demanding immediate attention and quick thinking. What Clark's new colleagues didn't know, what nobody in Metropolis knew, was that Clark Kent harbored an extraordinary secret. He wasn't originally from Smallville, or even from Earth. As a baby, he had arrived from a distant planet called Krypton, adopted and raised by Martha and Jonathan Kent, two of the kindest people who had ever lived. Under Earth's yellow sun, Clark had developed abilities that defied every law of physics. He could fly. He possessed strength that could move mountains. His vision could see through walls or across vast distances. He could hear conversations happening miles away. For years, Clark had struggled with how to use these gifts. His adoptive parents had taught him that with great power came great responsibility. But they had also warned him about the dangers of revealing his true nature. People might fear him, or worse, try to use him for purposes that weren't good. So Clark had learned to hide his abilities, to appear ordinary, to blend into whatever community he found himself in. But recently, as he witnessed accidents and crimes throughout Metropolis, Clark found it increasingly difficult to stand by and do nothing. When he saw a child about to run into traffic, every instinct screamed at him to move faster than human eyes could follow and sweep the child to safety. When he heard cries for help from burning buildings, his heart demanded that he use his strength to rescue those trapped inside. So Clark had begun helping people, always carefully, always making sure no one saw exactly what he was doing, always disappearing before questions could be asked. He told himself he was being careful. He convinced himself that no one would notice a pattern. But Clark underestimated the sharp mind and persistent curiosity of one Lois Lane. On this particular Tuesday morning, Clark arrived at the Daily Planet offices to find the newsroom buzzing with unusual energy. Reporters clustered around desks, voices raised in animated discussion. Photographers compared images on their cameras. Even Perry White, the gruff editor-in-chief, who rarely showed excitement about anything, was pacing near the assignment desk with obvious anticipation. Clark hung his coat on the rack near his desk and approached Jimmy Olsen, the young photographer who had been the first person to welcome Clark to the Daily Planet family. Jimmy was practically vibrating with excitement, his red hair even more tousled than usual, his camera hanging around his neck like a badge of honor. "What's happening?" Clark asked, adjusting his glasses and looking around at the commotion. "You haven't heard?" Jimmy's eyes widened with disbelief. Lois Lane is about to break the biggest story of the decade, maybe the century. She thinks there's some kind of superhuman guardian watching over Metropolis. Clark felt his stomach drop, though he managed to keep his expression neutral and mildly curious. "A superhuman guardian? She's been collecting evidence for weeks," Jimmy continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Witness accounts, photographs, police reports. She thinks someone with incredible abilities has been secretly saving people all over the city. And get this, she thinks she's figured out a way to make contact." Before Clark could ask what that meant, a commotion near the elevator announced Lois's arrival. She strode into the newsroom, carrying a large cardboard box, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her brown eyes bright with determination and exhaustion. She had clearly been working late into the night again, but her energy was infectious. Other reporters automatically stepped aside as she made her way to her desk, and Clark found himself staring despite his better judgment. There was something magnetic about the way Lois moved through the world. She walked like someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve, never met a truth she couldn't uncover. Her confidence wasn't arrogant or dismissive. Instead, It seemed to spring from genuine competence and a deep belief that information, properly gathered and carefully analyzed, could illuminate even the darkest mysteries. Lois set her box on her desk and immediately began pulling out files, photographs, and what appeared to be a detailed map of Metropolis, covered in colored pins and connecting strings. Clark realized he was still staring and quickly looked away, pretending to organize the papers on his own desk while listening to the conversations happening around him. "Lane's lost it this time," muttered Steve Lombard, a sports reporter known more for his ego than his writing ability. "Guardian angels don't sell newspapers. People want real stories about real people doing real things." But Perry White disagreed. "If anyone can prove the impossible, it's Lois," he announced, loud enough for the entire newsroom to hear. "She's got the best instincts of any reporter I've ever worked with. If she says, 'There's a story here,' there's a story here." Clark felt a mixture of admiration and terror. Admiration because Lois Lane was clearly everything he had heard she was: intelligent, determined, fearless in pursuit of truth. Terror because if anyone could uncover his secret, it would be someone exactly like her. As if sensing his thoughts, Lois looked up from her desk, and her eyes met Clark's across the newsroom. For a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, they simply looked at each other. Clark felt something shift in the air between them, something he couldn't quite name, but that made his heart beat faster. Lois tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intensity she probably brought to all her investigations. Then, Jimmy Olsen bounded over to Clark's desk, breaking the spell. "Come on, Kent. Lois wants to meet the new guy. And trust me, you want to make a good impression. She's the best reporter in the city." Clark stood slowly, smoothing down his hair and adjusting his tie. He had faced down tornadoes and stopped runaway trains, but somehow the prospect of introducing himself to Lois Lane felt more intimidating than any physical challenge he had ever encountered. As he walked across the newsroom toward her desk, Clark tried to calm his racing pulse. He reminded himself to appear normal, friendly, but not too eager, competent, but not suspiciously so. He had practiced this routine countless times in Smallville and during his first weeks in Metropolis. Just be Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter from Kansas. Don't give anyone any reason to look too closely. But when Lois Lane stood up from her desk and extended her hand to shake his, when she smiled and said, "You must be Clark Kent. I'm Lois Lane. Welcome to the Daily Planet," Clark realized that all his careful preparations might not be enough, because something extraordinary was happening, something that had nothing to do with superhuman abilities or mysterious rescues, something that felt like the beginning of the most important story either of them would ever be part of. Standing there in the middle of the bustling newsroom, Clark felt time slow to a gentle crawl. Lois's handshake was firm and warm, her smile genuine and welcoming, but it was her eyes that caught him completely off guard. They held a sparkle of curiosity that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of openness that suggested she might actually be interested in who he really was beneath the surface. "It's wonderful to meet you, Miss Lane," Clark managed, his voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in his chest. "I've heard incredible things about your work here." "Just Lois, please," she replied, releasing his hand, but continuing to study his face with that same gentle intensity. "And I hope what you've heard has been mostly good. Sometimes my enthusiasm for certain stories makes people think I'm a little too passionate about my job." Clark found himself smiling naturally, for the first time since arriving at the Daily Planet. I don't think there's such a thing as being too passionate about finding the truth. Something in Lois's expression softened at his words. That's exactly what I believe. Most people think journalism is just about getting the story first, but I think it's about getting the story right, about making sure people know what's really happening in their world. Perry White's voice boomed across the newsroom before Clark could respond. Lane, Kent, less chatting, more writing. We've got a newspaper to put out, and the city of Metropolis is counting on us to keep them informed. Lois rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Perry sounds gruff, but he's actually a big softy underneath all that bluster. He just wants us to remember that every story we write might be the most important thing someone reads today. As Clark returned to his desk, he found it difficult to concentrate on the assignment Perry had given him. Instead, his attention kept drifting to Lois, who had spread her mysterious research across every available surface of her workspace. She worked with the kind of focused intensity that Clark recognized in himself when he was trying to solve a particularly challenging problem. Every few minutes, she would pick up a photograph, examine it closely, then add it to one of several carefully organized piles. Around lunchtime, Clark noticed that Lois hadn't moved from her desk. While other reporters headed out for sandwiches or gathered in the break room to share office gossip, she remained hunched over her papers, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. Clark found himself wondering when she had last eaten, or if she had remembered to eat at all. Without really thinking about it, Clark walked to the small delicatessen across the street from the Daily Planet building. The owner, Mr. Kowalski, was a cheerful man who had emigrated from Poland decades ago and who took enormous pride in making the best sandwiches in downtown Metropolis. Clark ordered 2 turkey and Swiss sandwiches, making sure to ask for extra pickles because he had noticed Lois eating pickles from a jar she kept in her desk drawer. When Clark returned to the newsroom carrying a brown paper bag, he felt suddenly self-conscious about his impulse. What if Lois thought he was presumptuous? What if she had already eaten? What if she didn't like turkey and Swiss? But before he could change his mind, he found himself standing beside her desk. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, holding up the bag. "You've been working pretty intensively, and I noticed you hadn't taken a lunch break." Lois looked up from her papers, blinking as if she had forgotten where she was. "Oh, lunch. I completely lost track of time." She glanced at the bag Clark was holding, then back at his face. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you, Clark. Thank you." They ate their sandwiches, sitting on the small balcony that overlooked Metropolis's central plaza. From up there, the city spread out below them, like a living map. Cars moved along the streets like tiny toys. People walked along the sidewalks, each one carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own challenges. Clark found himself thinking about how many of those people he had helped in recent weeks, always from a distance, always anonymously. "What do you think about when you look out at the city?" Lois asked, following his gaze across the urban landscape. Clark considered his answer carefully. "I think about how many stories are happening down there at any given moment. Happy stories, sad stories, ordinary stories that might become extraordinary if someone paid attention to them." Lois nodded thoughtfully. "I think about that too, but I also think about responsibility. All those people trust that someone is watching out for them, whether it's the police or the fire department, or even just other people who care enough to help when help is needed." "Do you think that's enough?" Clark asked quietly. "The official protection, I mean." "Honestly, no." Lois turned to look at him directly. "I think sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. That's actually what I'm investigating right now." Clark's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice casual. The guardian angel story. People keep calling it that, but I don't think what's happening is supernatural, Lois explained, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm Clark was beginning to recognize. I think there's someone out there, someone with abilities we don't understand yet, who has decided to use those abilities to help people. And I think that's the most hopeful thing I've ever heard of. Hopeful? Clark hadn't expected that reaction. Think about it, Lois continued, leaning forward with growing excitement. If someone had incredible power, truly incredible power, what would most people do with it? They'd probably use it to make themselves wealthy, or famous, or influential. But this person, whoever they are, is using their gifts quietly, anonymously, just to make life safer for complete strangers. That tells me something beautiful about human nature. Clark felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. You really believe that? That someone would use power that way? I have to believe it, Lois said simply, because the alternative is too depressing to consider. I'd rather live in a world where extraordinary people choose to be extraordinarily good. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city pulse with life below them. Clark found himself marveling at the way Lois saw the world. Where others might see his secret activities as frightening or threatening, she saw hope. Where others might demand explanations or proof, she seemed content to believe in the possibility of goodness. When they returned to the newsroom, Clark discovered that working in the same space as Lois Lane was both inspiring and distracting. She approached every assignment with the same passionate attention to detail she brought to her guardian angel investigation. When Perry assigned her to cover a city council meeting about new traffic lights, she researched the intersection accident statistics for the past 5 years. When she interviewed the owner of a new bookstore, she spent an hour learning about his family's immigration story and how literature had helped them feel at home in America. But it was her kindness to her colleagues that impressed Clark most. When Jimmy Olsen struggled with a difficult photography assignment, Lois spent her lunch break teaching him about lighting and composition. When Steve Lombard's computer crashed and he lost an entire article, Lois helped him recreate it from memory and notes, never once mentioning that he had been mocking her work earlier that same week. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the newsroom gradually emptied. Reporters finished their stories and headed home to families, friends, or simply to dinner and television. Perry White locked his office and called out his usual goodbye. Don't work too late, people. The news will still be here tomorrow. But Lois remained at her desk, now illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp as the sun set behind the metropolis skyline. Clark had finished his own assignments, but he found himself reluctant to leave. Instead, he organized his desk, filed his notes, and tried to think of legitimate reasons to linger. You don't have to stay on my account, Lois said, without looking up from her papers. I know I have a reputation for working ridiculously late hours. I don't mind, Clark replied honestly. Besides, I'm still getting used to the city. Back in Smallville, most people were in bed by 9 o'clock. The energy here is different. It's like the city never really sleeps. That's one of the things I love about Metropolis, Lois agreed, finally looking up from her work. There's always something happening. Always someone who needs help. Always a story waiting to be discovered. It can be overwhelming sometimes, but it's also exhilarating. Clark nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Can I ask you something about your current investigation? Of course. What will you do if you actually make contact with this person? This guardian? Lois was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "I think I'd want to say thank you first, and then I'd want to understand why they've chosen to help people the way they have. What motivates someone to use extraordinary abilities for ordinary kindness? And you wouldn't be afraid of someone who spends their time saving people?" Lois shook her head. "No, I don't think I'd be afraid. Curious, definitely. Amazed, probably, but not afraid." Clark felt something warm settle in his chest at her words. Here was someone who might actually understand. Someone who saw heroism not as a burden or a threat, but as a choice to be celebrated. "Besides," Lois continued with a small smile, "I have a theory that anyone who goes to such lengths to remain anonymous probably values privacy and respect as much as I do. I don't think they'd hurt someone who approached them with genuine gratitude and honest curiosity." Seer. As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion erupted from the street below. Car horns honked frantically, and Clark could hear shouting voices even through the thick windows of the Daily Planet building. Both Clark and Lois rushed to the window to see what was happening. In the plaza below, a city bus had somehow lost control and was careening toward a group of evening commuters waiting at a crosswalk. Clark's enhanced vision could see everything with perfect clarity. The bus driver slumped over the wheel, apparently unconscious. The brake lines had somehow snapped. The pedestrians were frozen in terror, unable to move quickly enough to avoid the massive vehicle bearing down on them. Clark's every instinct screamed at him to act, to use his speed and strength to stop the bus before anyone could be hurt. But Lois was standing right beside him, watching everything unfold. If he moved at superhuman speed now, she would see exactly what he was capable of. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Clark stood paralyzed by indecision. Save those people and risk exposing his secret to the one person whose opinion had somehow become incredibly important to him, or protect his identity and potentially watch innocent people suffer. Then Lois grabbed his arm, her fingers tight with urgent concern. "Someone needs to call for help. Those people are going to get hurt." Her touch, her trust, her immediate concern for strangers in danger made Clark's choice crystal clear. Some things were more important than secrets, more important than safety, more important than fear. "Stay here," Clark said quietly, gently removing Lois's hand from his arm. "I'll be right back." Before she could ask what he meant, Clark was gone, moving faster than human eyes could follow, leaving only a small breeze and the faint scent of his aftershave behind. Down in the plaza, chaos unfolded in what felt like slow motion to anyone watching from above. The runaway bus continued its dangerous path toward the cluster of evening commuters, who were now scattering in all directions, some stumbling, others calling out warnings to friends and strangers alike. The driver remained unconscious behind the wheel, completely unaware of the disaster about to unfold. But then, something extraordinary happened, something that would later be described differently by every witness who saw it. A flash of blue and red appeared between the bus and the pedestrians. The massive vehicle, which had been moving with unstoppable momentum just moments before, suddenly came to a gentle stop, as if invisible hands had reached out to cradle it with impossible care. The bus driver stirred, blinking in confusion as he found his vehicle perfectly positioned in an empty section of the street, far from any pedestrians or other cars. The people who had been in danger looked around in bewilderment, trying to understand how they had all somehow moved to safety without remembering taking the steps to get there. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance as police cars and ambulances responded to the multiple calls that had flooded the emergency dispatch center. But by the time the first responders arrived, there was remarkably little for them to do. The bus driver was conscious and unharmed, though he would need medical attention for whatever had caused his fainting spell. The pedestrians were shaken, but completely safe. The bus itself showed no signs of damage, despite its dramatic stop. Meanwhile, several floors above, in the Daily Planet newsroom, Lois Lane stood at the window, staring down at the scene below, trying to process what she had just witnessed. One moment, Clark had been standing beside her, his face pale with concern, as they watched the crisis unfold. The next moment, he had simply vanished, leaving her alone at the window with nothing but questions and the lingering scent of his cologne. She had been so focused on the drama in the street that she hadn't immediately noticed Clark's disappearance. But when she turned to share her amazement at how quickly the emergency services had responded, she found herself talking to empty air. Clark was nowhere to be seen in the newsroom, which was now completely deserted except for her. Lois felt a strange flutter in her chest, though she couldn't quite identify whether it was confusion, concern, or something else entirely. Where could Clark have gone so quickly? And why did his sudden departure feel somehow connected to the miraculous resolution of the crisis below? She was still puzzling over these questions when the elevator dinged softly, and Clark emerged, slightly out of breath and looking somewhat disheveled. His hair was messier than usual, his tie was askew, and there was an odd tension around his eyes, as if he was concentrating very hard on appearing calm. "Sorry about that," Clark said, straightening his tie and smoothing his hair as he approached her at the window. "I realized I had left my wallet in my coat pocket downstairs, and with all the commotion outside, I thought I should make sure the lobby was secure." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about it didn't quite satisfy Lois's reporter instincts. She had been developing those instincts for years, learning to notice when people's words didn't quite match their body language, when explanations felt almost right, but not entirely complete. "The lobby?" Lois asked, studying Clark's face carefully. "That must have been quite a trip. You were gone for less than 5 minutes, but you look like you've been running." Clark's hand moved unconsciously to his throat, adjusting his collar. The elevators were acting strangely because of all the emergency vehicles outside. "I ended up taking the stairs, 23 floors down and back up again. I'm probably more out of shape than I thought." Again, it was plausible, but Lois had noticed that Clark didn't seem out of shape at all. In fact, despite his mild-mannered appearance and slightly rumpled clothing style, he moved with the kind of easy grace that suggested considerable physical fitness, and his breathing was already returning to normal, which seemed remarkably quick for someone who had just climbed 46 flights of stairs. "Did you see what happened down there?" Lois asked, gesturing toward the plaza where emergency workers were now helping the bus driver into an ambulance. It was the most incredible thing. That bus should have hit those people, but somehow everyone ended up safe. Clark joined her at the window, and Lois noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the windowsill. "I'm just glad no one was hurt," he said quietly. "Sometimes terrible things almost happen, and then somehow they don't." There was something in his voice, a quality that Lois couldn't quite identify. Relief, certainly, but also something deeper, something that sounded almost like personal responsibility, as if he felt somehow connected to the positive outcome. "Clark," Lois said gently, "are you all right? You seem shaken up." He turned to look at her, and for a moment, Lois felt like she was seeing past the mild-mannered reporter facade to something much more complex underneath. His blue eyes held depths she hadn't noticed before, and there was a weight in his expression that seemed far too heavy for someone who had supposedly spent the last few minutes retrieving a wallet. "I'm fine," Clark said, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just that seeing people in danger affects me more than it probably should. I have a hard time standing by when I know someone needs help." That, Lois realized, was probably the most honest thing he had said since returning from his mysterious errand. And it was exactly the kind of thing someone might say if they had somehow been involved in helping those people, even if they couldn't or wouldn't explain exactly how. "That's not a character flaw, you know," Lois said softly. "Caring about strangers, wanting to help when you see people in trouble, that's what makes someone a good person." Clark's expression softened, and some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. "Thank you for saying that. Sometimes it feels like caring too much about people you don't even know is a luxury most adults can't afford." "Maybe that's the problem," Lois replied. "Maybe we'd all be better off if more people cared too much instead of too little." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the last of the emergency vehicles departed from the plaza below. The evening commuters had resumed their journeys home, and within minutes, it was almost impossible to tell that anything unusual had happened. The city had absorbed the crisis and moved on, the way cities always do. But Lois found herself unable to move on quite so easily. Her investigative instincts were humming with the kind of energy that usually meant she was on the verge of uncovering something important. The timing of Clark's disappearance and return, the mysterious way the crisis had resolved itself, the strange tension she sensed in him now. None of it proved anything, but all of it felt connected in ways she couldn't yet articulate. "Clark," she said carefully, "can I ask you something that might sound a little strange?" He tensed slightly, but nodded. "Of course. Do you believe that there are people in the world who are capable of extraordinary things? People who might have abilities that most of us can't understand or explain?" Clark was quiet for a long moment, and Lois could see him considering his answer very carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that the world is full of mysteries we haven't solved yet. And I think that sometimes the most extraordinary thing about a person isn't what they can do, but what they choose to do with whatever abilities they have." It wasn't a direct answer to her question, but it was thoughtful and honest in a way that made Lois respect him even more. And there was something in his tone that suggested he had given considerable thought to questions about extraordinary abilities and the responsibilities that might come with them. "What if I told you," Lois continued, "that I've been investigating someone who I believe has been using extraordinary abilities to help people throughout Metropolis? Someone who seems to appear whenever there's a crisis, who can do things that shouldn't be physically possible, but who always disappears before anyone can thank them or even get a good look at them." Clark's breathing had become very careful and controlled. "What would you want to say to someone like that if you ever had the chance to meet them?" The question surprised Lois, both because of how quickly he had asked it and because of how personal it sounded, as if he wasn't asking hypothetically, but as if her answer might actually matter to someone in particular. "I'd want to say that what they're doing matters," Lois said simply. "That even if nobody knows their name or their face, their kindness is making the world a better place. And I'd want them to know that they don't have to carry the weight of helping everyone all by themselves." Clark turned to face her fully, and Lois was struck by the intensity of his gaze. "You wouldn't be afraid of someone with that kind of power? Should I be?" Some people would say yes. They'd say that anyone with extraordinary abilities is automatically dangerous, that power like that can't be trusted. Lois shook her head firmly. Power doesn't make someone dangerous. What makes someone dangerous is how they choose to use whatever power they have. And someone who uses extraordinary abilities to save strangers, someone who helps people and then disappears without seeking credit or recognition, that sounds like someone who understands exactly what power should be used for. Clark was quiet for such a long time that Lois began to worry she had said something wrong. But when he finally spoke, his voice was soft and filled with something that sounded like gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "I think you might be one of the most remarkable people I've ever met." Before Lois could ask what he meant by that, Clark was gathering his things from his desk, putting on his coat, and preparing to leave for the evening. But he moved differently now, with less of the awkward hesitation she had noticed during his first weeks at the Daily Planet. Instead, he seemed more centered, more confident, as if their conversation had somehow settled something important for him. "Good night, Lois," Clark said as he headed toward the elevator. "And thank you for lunch and for the conversation. Both meant more to me than you might realize." After he was gone, Lois remained at the window for a long time, watching the lights of Metropolis twinkle to life as darkness settled over the city. Somewhere out there, she was convinced, was someone with extraordinary abilities who had chosen to use those gifts in service of ordinary kindness, someone who saved people and asked for nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference. What she was beginning to suspect, though she hardly dared admit it even to herself, was that this mysterious guardian might not be as much of a stranger as she had originally thought. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered. But Lois had always been good at seeing patterns where others saw only random events, and the pattern that was emerging suggested that her guardian angel might sit much closer than she had ever imagined, might, in fact, sit just one desk away from her own. As the days passed, Lois found herself paying closer attention to Clark Kent than perhaps a professional colleague strictly warranted. She told herself it was purely journalistic curiosity. After all, everyone had layers, and she had built her career on uncovering the stories that people didn't necessarily want to tell. But if she was being completely honest with herself, which Lois always tried to be, her interest in Clark went beyond professional intrigue. There was something almost musical about the way he moved through the newsroom. He was gentle with the coffee pot when others banged it around carelessly. He held doors for people without making a show of it. When elderly visitors struggled with the heavy entrance to the Daily Planet building, Clark somehow always appeared to help them, as if he had been watching for exactly those moments when quiet assistance might be needed. Most remarkably, Clark seemed to possess an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. When Jenny from accounting dropped a stack of papers in the lobby, Clark was there to help gather them before the wind from the revolving door could scatter them across the marble floor. When Mr. Peterson from the mailroom strained his back lifting a heavy package, Clark appeared with offers to carry the load and suggestions for where Mr. Peterson might find a comfortable chair to rest. These weren't dramatic rescues or headline-worthy heroics. They were small kindnesses that most people would never notice, let alone remember. But Lois noticed. She had trained herself to observe human behavior, and Clark's behavior was consistently, remarkably thoughtful in ways that seemed almost too good to be true. During their second week of working together, Lois decided to test a theory that had been forming in her mind. She had been tracking the mysterious rescues throughout Metropolis for months now, and she had recently begun to notice that they seemed to occur more frequently during certain hours. Specifically, during the hours when Clark Kent was not visibly present in the Daily Planet newsroom. So, Lois began keeping a discreet log. When Clark stepped out for lunch, she noted the time. When he left for the evening, she marked it down. When he arrived late or left early for appointments, she made careful records. It wasn't stalking, she told herself. It was investigative journalism. She was simply gathering data to either support or disprove a hypothesis. The results, after 2 weeks of careful observation, were fascinating. On Tuesday afternoon, Clark had left the office at 2:30, claiming he needed to visit his dentist. At 2:45, witnesses reported that someone had prevented a construction crane from toppling over at a building site across town. On Thursday evening, Clark had departed at 6 o'clock for what he said was dinner with a college friend visiting from out of town. At 6:15, a runaway subway car had been mysteriously stopped before it could derail and injure passengers. The timing wasn't perfect. It was entirely possible that Clark Kent was exactly who he claimed to be, a mild-mannered reporter from Kansas who happened to have good instincts about when people needed help and who happened to work in a city where miraculous rescues occurred with unusual frequency. But the pattern was suggestive enough to keep Lois's curiosity burning bright. What made the whole situation even more intriguing was that Clark seemed genuinely interested in her guardian angel investigation. Most of their colleagues either dismissed her research as fantasy or worried that she was wasting time on stories that couldn't be proven. But Clark asked thoughtful questions about her evidence. He listened carefully when she described witness accounts. He seemed to understand why the story mattered to her, even if he couldn't quite explain his own interest in her findings. On Friday afternoon, as autumn rain drummed steadily against the newsroom windows, Lois made a decision that felt both completely logical and slightly insane. She was going to tell Clark about her suspicions, not accusingly, not demandingly, but honestly. She was going to share her theory and see how he responded. The newsroom was quieter than usual because of the weather. Many of the staff had left early to avoid the worst of the storm, and Perry White was in his office with the door closed, arguing loudly with someone on the telephone about deadline pressures and budget constraints. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for a private conversation. Lois walked over to Clark's desk, where he was typing steadily on an article about the city's new recycling program. Even his approach to mundane assignments impressed her. While other reporters might dash off a few paragraphs and call it finished, Clark had clearly researched the environmental impact of different recycling methods and interviewed both city officials and ordinary citizens about their experiences with the new system. "Clark," Lois said softly, settling into the chair beside his desk. "Can I talk to you about something?" He looked up immediately, giving her his full attention in the way that had become familiar and somehow comforting. "Of course. Is everything all right? I think you might be able to help me with my guardian angel story." Clark's fingers stilled on his keyboard, though his expression remained calm and mildly curious. "How so?" Lois took a deep breath, committing herself to honesty, even though she wasn't entirely sure where it would lead. "I think you know more about these mysterious rescues than you've told me, and I think you might know more about the person responsible for them than you've told me." For several seconds, Clark said nothing. He simply looked at her with those remarkably blue eyes, and Lois could almost see him weighing different possible responses. She had seen that same careful consideration in sources who were deciding whether to trust her with sensitive information. "What makes you think that?" Clark asked finally. "Partly timing," Lois admitted. I've noticed that some of the most dramatic rescues seem to happen when you're not in the office, but mostly it's instinct. You care about people in a way that feels personal, as if helping strangers isn't just a nice idea for you, but something closer to a calling. Clark was quiet for so long that Lois began to worry she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she had misread all the signs. Perhaps Clark was simply a kind person who happened to work in a city where unexplained things occurred. And now she had made him uncomfortable by suggesting he was somehow involved in mysteries he knew nothing about. But then Clark spoke, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. If someone you cared about was keeping a secret that wasn't meant to hurt anyone, but that they felt they had to keep for safety reasons, would you want them to trust you with it? The question made Lois's heart race, though she tried to keep her expression calm and encouraging. I would want them to know that they could trust me, and I would want them to know that some secrets are too big to carry alone. Clark reached across the small space between their desks and gently took Lois's hand in his. His touch was warm and steady, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of truth finally being shared. Lois, he said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've wanted to tell you since the moment we met, but I wasn't sure how, or if I should, or if you'd be able to understand. She squeezed his hand encouragingly, her eyes bright with curiosity and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like affection. I'm not exactly who I appear to be, Clark continued, his voice barely above a whisper in the empty newsroom. I mean, I am Clark Kent, and I am from Kansas, and I do believe in truth and justice and helping people. But I'm also someone else, someone who can do things that most people would find impossible to believe. Lois felt her breath catch, but not from fear, from wonder, from the realization that her instincts had been right, that the pattern she had been following was real, that the guardian angel she had been seeking was sitting right beside her. You're him, she said simply. You're the one who's been saving people. Clark nodded, and in that gesture, Lois could see years of loneliness and secrecy finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. I wanted to tell you, he said. Every day, I wanted to tell you, because you see the world the way I wish everyone could see it. With hope, with faith in people's goodness, with the belief that extraordinary things happen when ordinary people choose to care about each other. They sat together in the gentle silence of the newsroom, rain pattering against the windows, the city humming with life beyond the walls. And in that moment, Lois understood that she had found something even more remarkable than the story she had been chasing. She had found someone who understood that the most extraordinary power in the world was the simple choice to help others, to protect what was precious, to use whatever gifts you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. Clark, Lois said softly, I think this might be the beginning of the most beautiful story either of us will ever be part of. And as the lights of Metropolis twinkled like stars beyond their window, Clark Kent smiled the kind of smile that could light up entire cities. And Lois Lane knew that some secrets were worth keeping, some mysteries were worth protecting, and some love stories were worth believing in. In this gentle tale of two hearts finding each other across impossible circumstances, we discover that the greatest adventures often begin not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with simple kindness, honest curiosity, and the courage to trust someone else with the truth of who we really are. Sweet dreams, and may your own story be filled with the kind of love that makes even the ordinary feel extraordinary.